The fluorescent lights flickered softly in room 217 at Lincoln High School, casting a warm autumn glow over the rows of students hunched over their desks. Most were scribbling answers on their test sheets, but not Elijah Bennett. Seated in the back near the window, Elijah's gaze drifted outside, following the steady sway of branches in the breeze. He leaned on one arm, absent-mindedly tapping his pencil against his notebook, completely detached from the scene around him. For Elijah, math class had long ceased to be a challenge. His mind worked faster than the classroom lessons ever could, solving problems far beyond his grade level during his free time. Yet, he preferred staying invisible. Being noticed came with risks, especially in a classroom like this. Unfortunately for him, Mrs. Victoria Hayward noticed everything. She was the kind of teacher who ruled her class with precision and authority, sharp-hued and sharp-tongued, with a reputation for not tolerating mediocrity. And right now, Mrs. Hayward was frustrated. The results from the latest math test sat in a neat stack on her desk, glaring at her like a personal failure. The majority of her students had barely passed, and the sight of so many low scores gnawed at her patience. As she handed back the papers, her comments were clipped and cold. Decent work. You need to study harder. Disappointing. When she reached Elijah's desk, her eyes lingered on his test paper. At the top, in bold red ink, was a perfect 100%. It wasn't the first time Elijah had aced a test, but it irritated her all the same. How could a student who seemed so uninterested excel so effortlessly? She said nothing as she placed the test in front of him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her frustration simmered just below the surface, but she kept moving. Once all the tests were returned, she stood at the front of the room, arms crossed. "Listen up." Her voice sliced through the chatter like a knife, silencing the students instantly. "Most of you did okay," she said, her tone heavy with disappointment. "But some of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks. This is basic algebra, people. If you don't get this now, you're going to have a hard time in high school, college, or anywhere else in life." Her eyes scanned the room, narrowing as they landed on Elijah, who was once again gazing out the window. Her irritation boiled over. Elijah Bennett. Elijah jolted upright, his heart thudding in his chest. Every head in the room turned toward him, and a hush fell over the class. "Care to tell us what's so interesting outside the window?" Mrs. Hayward's voice was cold and challenging. Nothing, ma'am." Elijah muttered, heat rushing to his cheeks. Mrs. Hayward folded her arms. "Well, since you seem so unbothered by today's lesson, why don't you show us how much you've learned?" She picked up a marker and walked to the board, her heels clicking against the tile. "Come on up here." The room grew painfully quiet. Elijah swallowed hard, his palms suddenly clammy. His classmates watched, with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "Oh, this is going to be good," one boy whispered. "She's setting him up," a girl muttered back, stifling a laugh. Mrs. Hayward scribbled a long, complex equation on the board. Far more advanced than anything they'd covered in class. It was an impossible challenge, and she knew it. "Solve it," she said, stepping aside and handing him the marker. "Show us what you've got." Elijah hesitated, staring at the tangled mess of variables and exponents. His pulse quickened. He could hear the snickers behind him and feel the weight of the class's judgment pressing on his shoulders. For a brief second he thought about walking away, but then something flickered inside him, a quiet, defiant voice reminding him of all the problems he'd solved in secret. He took a deep breath and grasped the marker. This was his moment. Elijah raised the marker to the whiteboard, his fingers tightening around it as the room seemed to close in around him. The equation was intimidating at first glance, a maze of variables, fractions, and exponents that could easily stump most students. Whispers filled the air behind him. "No way he's solving that," someone muttered. "He's toast," another added with a chuckle. Elijah's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he stared at the equation, breaking it down piece by piece in his mind. Slowly, methodically, the familiar rhythm of problem-solving began to settle his nerves. Mrs. Hayward crossed her arms, watching him closely. She had chosen the equation deliberately, a challenge she believed was beyond his capabilities. To her, this was a teachable moment, a chance to humble a student who she felt needed a reminder that raw talent without discipline wouldn't get him far. "Well," she prompted, "we're waiting." The weight of her words hung in the air, but Elijah refused to let them crush him. His mind moved quickly, isolating the variables and finding patterns. His first stroke with the marker was slow and careful, but as he worked through the equation, his confidence grew. His hand moved faster, breaking down each step with clarity and precision. The laughter faded. One by one, his classmates leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the board. "Wait, is he doing it?" a girl whispered. "It looks right," her friend replied, eyebrows raised. The hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound as Elijah dismantled the equation with ease. He simplified fractions, eliminated unnecessary steps, and isolated the variable in record time. Each line of his solution was clean and deliberate. The squeak of the marker became a steady rhythm, almost hypnotic. Mrs. Hayward's eyes narrowed. She had expected hesitation, maybe even failure, but what she saw was something entirely different. Elijah wasn't struggling at all. He was in control. Each step was perfectly executed. By the time he reached the final line, the classroom was silent. Elijah circled the answer with a confident flourish, clicked the cap back on the marker, and turned to face the class. His heart was pounding, but his expression was calm and steady. The silence stretched for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. The applause grew, filling the room as students exchanged stunned glances. Even those who had been quick to judge him moments earlier now looked at him with something close to awe. Mrs. Hayward stepped closer to the board, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She studied the solution, her finger tracing each line, checking his work with a sharp focus. Her lips moved silently as she verified the steps, her brow furrowing for a brief moment before smoothing out again. Finally, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "This is correct?" she said, her voice softer than usual. Another ripple of murmurs spread through the room, followed by more applause. Elijah stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something new. Pride. "Promise me." Mrs. Hayward cleared her throat, raising a hand to quiet the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said, gesturing to the board. "This is what happens when someone takes the time to truly understand the material. Elijah didn't just solve this problem. He broke it down and made it look easy. That's what real understanding looks like." Her eyes lingered on Elijah, her tone softening. "Elijah, why haven't you spoken up before? If you can do this, why do you sit in the back and stay so quiet?" Elijah hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. How could he explain it? How could he put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of staying invisible? After a moment, he shrugged. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Mrs. Hayward's expression softened. "Well, it's time for that to change," she said. The applause lingered in Elijah's ears as he walked back to his seat, his thoughts swirling. For the first time, his classmates were looking at him differently, not with ridicule or indifference, but with genuine curiosity and respect. A girl in the row ahead turned around, her eyes wide. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Elijah shrugged, unsure of how to answer. I just figured it out," he said quietly. Another student chimed in. "That was insane. Are you like a genius or something?" Elijah shook his head quickly, his cheeks flushing. "No, I just like math." As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Hayward called out, "Elijah, can you stay for a moment?" The class began to file out, but not before several students stopped to pat him on the back or offer a quick, "That was awesome." Elijah nodded awkwardly, clutching his notebook tighter. The attention was new, and while part of him wanted to retreat back to the comfort of anonymity, another part of him felt something else. A flicker of pride. Once the room emptied, Mrs. Hayward leaned against her desk, studying him with an expression Elijah couldn't quite read. "Ijao," she began, her tone softer than before, "I owe you an apology." Elijah blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "An apology?" Mrs. Hayward nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I know my students, but with you," she paused, searching for the right words, "I misjudged you. I thought your quietness meant you weren't interested. I assumed your lack of participation meant you didn't care. Clearly, I was wrong." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "It's okay," he mumbled. "No, it's not," Mrs. Hayward said firmly. "You have a gift, Elijah. Do you realize how rare it is for someone your age to solve a problem like that? To think the way you do?" Elijah looked down at his notebook, tracing the edges with his fingers. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Hayward's expression softened. "That's exactly what makes it special. You see things differently, and that's something to be proud of. But you can't keep it to yourself. There are programs, competitions, and even advanced courses that could help you grow. I'd be happy to help you find them, if you're interested." Elijah's heart raced. The idea of stepping into a world beyond his quiet, personal learning was both thrilling and terrifying. He thought back to the moment at the board, the way everything had clicked into place, the way the room had felt afterward. Could he do more? Could he be more? "I don't know," he admitted. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Hayward smiled. "Messing up is part of learning, but if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of." Elijah's mind swirled with possibilities as he walked out of the classroom. Mrs. Hayward's words echoed in his head. "You have a gift. You can't keep it to yourself." For so long he had kept his talent hidden, afraid that standing out would bring attention he didn't want, but now everything felt different. His classmates had seen him, really seen him, and it wasn't the kind of attention that made him want to shrink into the background. The hallway buzzed with the usual after-class energy, but Elijah walked in a daze, barely noticing the chatter around him. "Yo, Elijah," a voice called. He turned to see Malcolm, one of the more popular kids in school, jogging to catch up with him. "That was wild back there," Malcolm said, grinning. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Elijah shrugged, his modesty kicking in. "I've just always liked math, I guess." "Nah, that wasn't just liking math. That was genius level," Malcolm insisted. "You should be on TV or something." Elijah chuckled, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but it didn't feel so bad. The next day, the atmosphere in the classroom was different. Students who had barely acknowledged him before now greeted him with nods, smiles, and even a few high fives. "Hey, Elijah," a girl named Mia called from across the room. "Do you think you can help me with the homework later?" Before he could answer, another student chimed in. "Me too. Seriously, I've been struggling with this stuff." Elijah blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. Was this what it felt like to be seen, to be respected? He nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. "Sure," he said. "I can help." At the front of the room, Mrs. Hayward watched the exchange with a satisfied smile. She had seen a lot of transformations in her years as a teacher, but this one felt different. Elijah wasn't just stepping into his potential, he was beginning to embrace it. As class began, Mrs. Hayward launched into the day's lesson, explaining a new concept on the board. When she turned to the class and posed a question, her eyes naturally drifted to Elijah. "Elijah," she said, "what do you think?" For a brief moment, the old instinct to stay quiet tugged at him, but something stronger, something new, pushed him to speak. "Well," he began, his voice steady, "if you break the equation into smaller steps, you can see that it's really just a combination of two simpler problems. Like this." He stood up, walked to the board, and started explaining. His explanation was clear and precise, and as he worked through the problem, the room fell into a familiar silence, the kind that only comes when people are truly listening. By the time he finished, several students were nodding and understanding. Mrs. Hayward smiled. "Excellent," she said. "That's exactly right." The sense of pride that filled Elijah was unlike anything he had felt before. It wasn't just about getting the answer right, it was about helping others see the path he had found so naturally. At the end of the day, Mrs. Hayward asked Elijah to stay behind once more. This time, she was holding a brochure. "Elijah? Get it?" "Elijah," she said, "I've been thinking about what we talked about. There's an advanced math program at the district level, a class for students who need more of a challenge. It meets after school twice a week, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Elijah took the brochure, his eyes scanning the glossy pages. The idea of joining an advanced class was exciting, but it was also intimidating. Was he ready for this? Could he really compete with students who were just as talented as him? Or even more so? "Do you think I'd be good enough for that?" he asked, glancing up at Mrs. Hayward. She smiled. "Elijah, you've already proven that you're more than good enough. This is a chance for you to explore your potential, to see how far you can go." Elijah thought about the way his classmates had looked at him. The respect, the curiosity, the admiration. He thought about the pride in his parents' eyes when he told them about solving the equation. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." The following week, Elijah attended his first advanced math class. His parents had driven him to the neighboring school, an unfamiliar building with sleek hallways and classrooms filled with students from across the district. As he stood outside the classroom, clutching his backpack tightly, a knot of nerves twisted in his stomach. The muffled hum of voices from inside reminded him of how he had felt when he first stepped up to the board in Mrs. Hayward's class, a mix of excitement and terror. What if I don't belong here? What if I can't keep up? The door swung open, and a tall, energetic man with salt and pepper hair stepped out. He smiled warmly at Elijah. "You must be Elijah," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Mr. Whitaker. Welcome to Advanced Mathematics." Elijah shook his hand, managing a small smile. "Thanks. Come on in, we're just getting started." The classroom was buzzing with energy. Students sat in clusters, their notebooks filled with complex equations and diagrams. The walls were lined with posters of famous mathematicians, formulas scrawled across whiteboards in neat rows. Elijah found a seat near the front, his heart still thumping. Mr. Whitaker stood at the board, launching into an explanation of today's lesson, a challenging concept involving quadratic equations and graph transformations. Elijah listened intently, his earlier nervousness slowly giving way to curiosity. "These problems are tricky," Mr. Whitaker said, turning to face the class. "But once you see the pattern, they start to make sense. Let's give it a try. Who wants to walk us through the first problem?" The room went quiet. A few students shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Elijah felt the familiar tug of hesitation, but decided to push past it. He raised his hand. "Yes, Elijah?" Mr. Whitaker said, a spark of surprise in his eyes. "Come on up." Elijah walked to the board, the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The problem looked intimidating at first, a dense cluster of numbers and variables. But as he studied it, the pieces started to fall into place. He picked up the marker and began writing. The equations flowed naturally, each step building on the last. His hand moved faster as the solution became clearer. The room was silent except for the sound of the marker against the board. When he finished, Elijah capped the marker and stepped back. The board was filled with neatly written steps, leading to a final answer circled at the bottom. He glanced at Mr. Whitaker, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Whitaker studied the board for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Impressive," he said. "That's exactly right, and not just right. Clear, logical, and well explained." He turned back to the class. "Take note of how Elijah broke down the problem. This is how you approach something complex. One step at a time." A few students whispered to each other, nodding in agreement. Elijah returned to his seat, feeling a rush of pride. By the end of the class, several students had introduced themselves, eager to talk to him. He discovered that many of them shared his love of solving puzzles, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged in a group that truly understood him. Back at Riverside Middle, word of Elijah's advanced class spread quickly. His classmates began to seek him out, not just for help with math, but as someone they admired and respected. "Elijah, can you check my homework?" one student asked as they gathered their books after class. Another chimed in, "Do you think you can tutor me before the quiz?" Elijah found himself saying yes more often than not. Each time he helped a classmate, he felt a growing confidence, not just in his abilities, but in his role as someone who could make a difference. Even Mrs. Hayward's approach changed. She called on him regularly during lessons, her tone always encouraging. She even began incorporating more challenging problems into the curriculum, inspired by Elijah's progress. One afternoon, Mrs. Hayward pulled him aside after class. "Elijah," she said, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. Watching you grow over these past weeks has been incredible. You're not just a great student, you're a leader." Elijah blinked, taken aback. "A leader?" "Yes," Mrs. Hayward said with a smile. "You've inspired your classmates to push themselves harder, to believe they can do more. That's what a leader does. And you're only just getting started." That night, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. His mother leaned against the counter, watching him with a proud smile. "You've always been special, Elijah," she said softly. "But it's different now. You're showing the world what we've always known." Elijah looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Mom," he said. As he turned back to his notebook, a thought struck him. For so long, his notebook had been a place for secrets, acquisitions scribbled in the margins, problems solved for no one but himself. But now, it felt like something more. It was a place for possibilities. He picked up his pencil and began to write, not just equations, but ideas, goals, and dreams. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of being seen. He was ready to step forward and see where his talent could take him. The following week felt like a whirlwind for Elijah. His mornings were filled with regular classes at Riverside Middle, and his afternoons were spent at the district's advanced math program. The pace was relentless, but Elijah found himself thriving in the challenge. At first, the advanced class had been intimidating, but he quickly realized he wasn't alone in his love for numbers and logic. The other students were equally curious and determined, eager to solve problems that stretched their abilities to the limit. Elijah loved the fast pace and the way his mind lit up with every new concept. Unlike the repetitive drills in his regular math class, these problems were complex puzzles begging to be unraveled. He became known among his new peers for his clarity of thought and calm confidence under pressure. One afternoon, the instructor handed out a particularly difficult problem, a multi-step challenge involving calculus principles far beyond what most students their age had encountered. The room filled with quiet murmurs as the students attempted to solve it, their pencils scratching furiously across their notebooks. Elijah stared at the problem for a moment, his mind already piecing together the different steps. "I think I see how to do it," he said aloud, surprising even himself. The instructor raised an eyebrow. "Why don't you show us?" Elijah walked to the board, his heart racing but his determination steady. He began to write, explaining each step as he went. The classroom was silent, every eye fixed on him. By the time he circled the final answer, there was a ripple of murmurs and nods of approval. The instructor clapped his hands. "Well done, Elijah, that was a tough one, and you broke it down beautifully. This is the kind of thinking that wins competitions." Competitions. The word hung in the air. Elijah had never thought about math as something competitive. "Competitions?" he asked, curiosity flickering in his voice. The instructor smiled. "Yes, math competitions. Think of them as a chance to test your skills against other top students. I think you'd do well." Later that evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his parents, recounting the day's events. His father leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Competitions, huh?" he said. "Sounds like a big opportunity." His mother nodded in agreement. "I think you should go for it, Elijah. You've got the talent. Why not see where it takes you?" Elijah tapped his pencil against the table, considering it. He had always solved problems for himself, but the idea of stepping onto a bigger stage both thrilled and terrified him. "What if I mess up?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His father leaned forward, resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Messing up is part of life, son. But not trying at all? That's the real failure. Remember, every step forward is a victory." Elijah took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Okay, I'll do it." The preparation for the competition was intense. Elijah spent his afternoons immersed in practice problems, guided by his instructor and cheered on by his classmates. At times, the pressure felt overwhelming, but Elijah pushed through, fueled by a determination he hadn't known he possessed. Mrs. Hayward had even heard about the competition and began offering extra help after school. Her encouragement felt genuine, a far cry from her earlier harshness. "Elijah," she told him one afternoon, "I've seen you grow so much these past few months. No matter what happens, you've already proven what you're capable of. I'm proud of you." Elijah smiled, the warmth of her words filling him with renewed confidence. The day of the competition arrived faster than Elijah had expected. The auditorium was packed with students from across the state, all buzzing with nervous energy. Elijah stood backstage, his palms damp with sweat. His instructor gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You've got this," he said. "Trust yourself." The competition was a blur of questions and answers, a rapid-fire test of speed and accuracy. Elijah's mind moved like lightning, each problem a new challenge to conquer. He felt the familiar rush of focus and clarity, the world fading away as he locked onto the numbers and equations before him. When the final round ended, Elijah leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how he had done, but he knew one thing. He had given it everything he had. The announcer stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. "And now, the winner of this year's Math Excellence Competition, Elijah Reynolds." The room erupted in applause. Elijah blinked, hardly believing what he had just heard. His classmates cheered from the audience, and his parents stood, clapping with pride. Elijah walked to the stage, his legs feeling like jelly. The announcer handed him a trophy, the weight of it solid and real in his hands. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes finding his parents. His mother wiped away a tear, her smile radiant. At that moment, Elijah felt something he hadn't expected, true belonging. For the first time, he wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the classroom. He was someone who had stepped forward, taken a risk, and succeeded. The announcer leaned in, whispering, "Congratulations. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. Back at school the next day, Elijah returned to a hero's welcome. His classmates surrounded him, eager to hear every detail of the competition. Even students who had never spoken to him before were now clamoring for his attention. "You've got to help me with my homework, Elijah," one student joked. "Dude, you're a legend," another added, clapping him on the back. Mrs. Hayward beamed from her desk, watching as Elijah navigated his newfound fame with quiet grace. "Elijah," she said as the class settled down, "why don't you tell us a little about what you learned at the competition?" Elijah stood, glancing around the room. The nervousness he had once felt when speaking in front of others was gone. "Honestly," he said, "the biggest thing I learned is that sometimes you have to take a chance on yourself. It's scary, but it's worth it." The class listened in rapt attention, hanging on his every word. As Elijah sat down, Mrs. Hayward nodded approvingly. "Well said, Elijah, well said." In the weeks following the competition, life changed for Elijah. The quiet boy who once blended into the background was now a source of inspiration for students and teachers alike. His story spread across the school, even reaching neighboring schools. The principal invited Elijah to speak at a special assembly about overcoming challenges and embracing one's potential. Standing on the stage in front of hundreds of students, Elijah felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but he also felt something stronger: pride. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think it was easier to stay quiet, to not be noticed. I was afraid of what might happen if I failed. But then I realized something. The only way to fail for sure is to never try at all." The auditorium was silent, every face turned toward him, hanging on his words. "I've learned that we all have something special inside us, something that makes us different, and that's not something to hide. It's something to share. You never know how far it can take you." Applause erupted as Elijah finished, his heart swelling with gratitude. He glanced at his parents in the front row, their eyes shining with pride. Back in the classroom, things had taken a different turn. Mrs. Hayward had changed too. The once stern teacher now made it her mission to encourage and uplift every student, especially the quieter ones. "Elijah taught me something important," she told the class one afternoon. "Everyone has potential, and it's my job to help you find yours." Her eyes softened as she glanced at Elijah. "No more hiding in the back, okay?" Elijah chuckled, nodding. "No more hiding." As the school year drew to a close, Elijah found himself thinking about the future. Opportunities were opening up: advanced programs, scholarships, and even national competitions. It was exciting and a little overwhelming. One afternoon, his instructor from the advanced math program called him aside. "Elijah," he said, "there's a national math competition coming up in a few months. It's the biggest one in the country. I think you should enter." Elijah blinked. The national competition. It sounded incredible but also intimidating. "Do you think I'm ready?" he asked, his voice tentative. The instructor smiled. "I know you are. You've proven that time and time again." Elijah thought of the countless hours he had spent working through problems, the thrill of solving something difficult, and the pride he felt when he stood on stage holding that trophy. "I'll do it," he said with newfound confidence. That night at dinner, Elijah shared the news with his parents. His mother smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We've always believed in you, Elijah. We're so proud of how far you've come." His father nodded, his voice steady and reassuring. "This is just the beginning, son. Keep going, keep reaching higher." Elijah felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of purpose solidifying within him. He was ready for whatever came next. As summer rolled around, Elijah threw himself into preparation for the national math competition. His days were filled with practice problems, late-night study sessions, and strategy meetings with his mentor. It was exhausting at times, but every step fueled his determination to give it his all. The support he received from his family, teachers, and even his classmates kept him motivated. Mrs. Hayward regularly checked in with him, offering words of encouragement and help whenever needed. "You've got this, Elijah," she would say, her voice brimming with confidence. "Just remember, take one step at a time, just like you did in class." When the day of the national competition arrived, Elijah found himself standing outside the large auditorium, clutching his notebook tightly. The air buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of students from across the country gathered, each representing the best of their schools. Elijah's heart pounded as he scanned the crowd. These were some of the brightest minds in the nation, and for a brief moment doubt tried to creep in. "Am I ready for this?" he wondered. But then a familiar voice echoed in his mind. His father's steady reassurance, his mother's unwavering support, and Mrs. Hayward's reminder that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. He straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The competition was intense. The problems were more complex than anything Elijah had faced before, each one demanding not only mathematical skill, but also creativity and quick thinking. He worked methodically, his mind breaking down each problem the way he had always done, piece by piece, step by step. Around him, other students scribbled furiously, the air filled with the soft scratch of pencils and the occasional shuffle of papers. Time seemed to blur as he worked, his focus narrowing to the numbers in front of him. There were moments when he stumbled, unsure of the next step, but each time he reminded himself to breathe, stay calm, and trust his instincts. As the final problem appeared on the screen, Elijah felt a jolt of recognition. It was similar to one he had struggled with during practice, but this time he knew exactly what to do. His hand flew across the page, solving it with newfound confidence. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, his heart still racing. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Slowly he set down his pencil and exhaled. He had done everything he could. The results were announced later that afternoon. Elijah stood among the other competitors, his palms clammy as the judges took the stage. In third place, the announcer began, pausing for dramatic effect. The crowd clapped politely as the winners stepped forward to claim their medal. In second place, another pause, more applause. Elijah felt his chest tighten. His name hadn't been called yet. And now the winner of this year's National Mathematics Championship. The announcer smiled. Elijah Reynolds. For a split second, Elijah froze. Had he heard that right? The room erupted into applause, snapping him back to reality. A wave of disbelief and joy washed over him as he stepped forward to accept his award. The medal felt cool and heavy in his hands, a tangible reminder of everything he had worked for. The announcer shook his hand, offering warm congratulations, but Elijah barely registered the words. His mind was spinning, replaying every step of the journey that had brought him here. Back at school, Elijah's victory was celebrated like a championship win. Posters with his name and picture hung in the hallways, and the principal held a special assembly in his honor. "Today we celebrate one of our own," the principal announced. "Elijah Reynolds has shown us the power of perseverance, hard work, and believing in yourself. He is an inspiration to us all." The crowd cheered, chanting his name. Elijah smiled, waving awkwardly from the stage, his cheeks flushing with pride. Mrs. Hayward stood in the front row, clapping the loudest. Later, she found him in the hallway, her eyes bright with excitement. "Elijah, I couldn't be prouder of you," she said. "You've shown everyone what it means to rise above expectations. You've reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." "Thank you, Mrs. Hayward," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without your support." That evening, Elijah sat at his desk, the medal hanging from a hook on the wall beside him. His notebook lay open, the pages filled with equations, notes, and new ideas waiting to be explored. His journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. He thought of the countless kids out there like him, quiet, overlooked, their potential hidden beneath the surface. He promised himself that one day he would find a way to help them, just as others had helped him. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that everyone deserved a chance to shine. With a quiet smile, Elijah picked up his pencil and began to write. That night, as Elijah sat in the glow of his desk lamp, he reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. The struggles, the self-doubt, and the quiet strength that had carried him through. He realized something deeply important. The power to succeed had always been inside him, waiting for the right moment to shine. He thought about the lessons he had learned, not just about math, but about life. He had learned that sometimes the world underestimates you, but you must never underestimate yourself. He had learned that staying silent doesn't protect you from being overlooked. It only hides your light from the world. Most importantly, Elijah understood that success wasn't just about talent or intelligence. It was about resilience, persistence, and the courage to step forward even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Turning toward his medal, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. Never be afraid to stand out again. He smiled, picking up his pencil once more, ready to chase new challenges and opportunities ahead. Have you ever felt underestimated or overlooked like Elijah? Remember, your potential is limitless. Your voice matters, and your talent is meant to be shared with the world. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and subscribe to join our growing community of dreamers and changemakers. Together, we can empower each other to break barriers and reach new heights.